Just quickly, I wanted to help you become a dead set Jedi on the tools this weekend by answering a couple of questions that have just come through in the comments feed, and they flow from that video I did just the other day on bolts, which seems like such a straightforward topic, but really there's a lot of nuance there, which you would know if you've ever been up to your chin in disassembled engine or components of that nature. The first one here is from a dude named Ian. When replacing suspension-related bolts, the repair procedure usually says to replace them, which makes sense if they are really rusted or damaged, but you said they can be reused a few times as long as you don't exceed the yield point. Why does the repair procedure say to replace them? In general, I'd say if there is a servicing procedure written down on paper, it's been produced by a whole bunch of properly propeller-headed engineers working in dark, dusty, and otherwise equally hateful R&D facilities, and they're doing really diligent work and they're hedging risk. So if they've decided that it really is appropriate to replace the fasteners when you do whatever job, then just replace them, dude, because fasteners are generally inexpensive compared with the cost of catastrophic failure. Like, if an engine fails in service, it's basically a throwaway. Same for a transmission. If a suspension fails in service, you could die. So it doesn't bear thinking about. The cost of the fasteners is trivial in comparison to the risk, so just do that. And even if they've decided that the risk of a fastener failing is, say, just pulling a number out of my ass, it's 1 in 1,000, if you've got 12 of those fasteners in a particular assembly, if that risk is 1 in 1,000, then that's 1 in every 80 rebuilds. Something's going to break if you don't replace the fasteners. And trust me on this, you don't want to be the one. It's also really difficult to be one size fits all about replacing bolts, because you think about an engine and all the different bolts in an engine and how many different frickin' jobs they do. So if you think about main bearing caps, kind of nice if they stay connected because they're holding the crankshaft into the block, among other things. They've got 2 to 4 bolts per cap holding them in place, and they do a big job withstanding cyclical loads. So if your engine does like 2,000 RPM on average for its entire life, every minute that it runs, every one of those cylinders is doing 1,000 sucks, 1,000 squeezes, 1,000 bangs, and 1,000 blows, because it's a 4-stroke engine and all it does is suck, squeeze, bang, and blow, right? Times 4 cylinders. So that's 4,000 bangs on the caps every minute. So if you run for 250 minutes, that's 1 million cycles, right? 1 million. That's like, my head is exploding. That's like, what, 4 hours of operation. So you think about how many hours an engine endures in its life, it's probably reasonable to replace all of those critical bolts that are gonna just be predisposed to catastrophic failure if you rebuild them and reuse them. It's a completely false economy. But when you look at something like a manifold, like an inlet manifold, it's really just a glorified pipe fitting, like a flange. So those pipes and the flange and those bolts, they're just really all working together to form a pressure-tight seal. And it's a pretty low-tech thing. And yeah, I get that there might be aluminium bits and cast iron bits and steel fasteners all together, and they've got different coefficients of thermal expansion. So every time they go through a temperature cycle from engine cold to engine at its nominal operating temperature and back, then there are differential thermal stresses involved there. But really, for manifold bolts, it's just not the same kind of high-pressure lifestyle as it is for the bolts holding the crankshaft into the engine and the con rods onto the crank pins, okay? It's just not. It's, for them, it's like over and over, faster than you can think, whereas for the manifold bolts, it's just like, yeah, still holding it in place, dude, kind of thing. So what I'd suggest with this sort of second tier of bolts that are really not working as hard in such a high pressure environment, you could just inspect them and you could look for physical signs of damage. You could brush them up on a wire wheel and just make sure that the gunk is all removed before reassembly. And if you want to do the ghetto hack, which I talked about just the other day, what you really need to do is get a really nice new nut and just run it up and down like this. And if the bolt has been overcranked at all in its life, the nut will bind. And if the nut binds, it's a throwaway. And my strong advice there would be, if you've got 12 fasteners and one of them binds up, then the rest are a bit suspect as well. So just bone them and get replacements. Now, there's a lot of mythology about replacement bolts, but realistically, I think manufacturers of cars probably are practicing extortion when it comes to selling you the bolts, because they practice pretty much extortion with every other spare part. And if you can speak bolt fluently, you can probably crack the code on many bolts and just order replacements from an engineering supplier. Like, that shouldn't really be a problem. There's generally a code on the head of most bolts, and some of them are really easy to crack. This one here just says, I hope you can see that, it just says 10.9. That's the class of high tensile fastener that this is. That 10.9 tells you what you need to know. You might see an 8.8 or a 12.9 there. That's for the metric ones. There are other sorts of head markings as well that are dead giveaways. So you might want to do a bit of research if you're confronted with some hieroglyphics on the head of a bolt. And to do that, you could get something like the Ajax Fastener Design Manual. It's got a whole bunch of pages on cracking the code if you're interested. And it's also compatible with all the Imperial grades. So if you can understand, locate, identify the class, the grade of the bolt, whatever, then you're well on the way to being able to replace it with a more low-cost option. And then all you have to do is be able to speak other aspects of bolt fluently. So you'd want to know what the thread is, and you would also want to know the style of head and the length. For a bolt or a screw, and the technical difference is that a screw typically has the thread over its whole length, whereas the bolt is only partially threaded, but that's more a semantic issue than anything else. We're talking about essentially the same threaded thing. The length is from under the head to the end of the shaft, except if it's a countersunk head. Then it's from the outside of the countersink to the end of the bolt or the screw. That's kind of important. And then you need to know what the head type is and what the thread is. If you don't understand threads, that's going to be a bit of a problem. I'll show you something you can buy to decode even that, however. There's actually a couple of different options here. There's a ghetto hack and a tool room hack. So I'll show you the tool room hack first. You're going to need your calipers. They can be the digital ones if you like, but you're going to have to measure the outside diameter of the threads, because that really matters. And then you're going to have to measure the thread profile itself. And the easiest way to do that in the tool room is you just get out your set of thread gauges, which has got a million different options in it, and then you just find whichever one of these little sawtooth gauges meets the threads. And it's interesting doing this when you're as blind as a bat up close, but it's that one, and I hope you can see that. That's the 2mm thread pitch. So you know, if you measure this, you just go, oh my God, it's 16, and this one fits, it's the 2, so it's M16 by 2. And then you know that you want, whatever it is, a 50mm flange head, socket head cap screw, countersunk head, hex head, bolt, whatever, M16 by 2. I'll take 12, thanks, dude. And it's got to be grade 10.9 if that's what came off the car. Definitely don't downgrade. If it's 12.9, don't downgrade to 10.9 or even worse, 8.8 or 4.6. Don't do that. Match everything up. And it's really important to do this, but it's not too hard. Now, if you want to do it the ghetto way, you can buy a set of these. These make it really simple, and they're more sort of automotive fastener size. They go up to 1/2 inch in Imperial, like UNC. There's Whitworth as well, and there's metric, and they've got internal and external threads. And if a thing screws into it, then guess what, dude? It's that thread. So this is an M12 by 1.75 socket head cap screw right here, and it's not going all that well into this red one, so it might not be that. So I'll try it on Yo Blue one, and guess what? It screws right in, and it's got on the side written what it is, and you know straight away. And if you want to measure a nut, you can do that as well, because it's got the male thread equivalent, and that really does take a lot of the pain out of this. So this has got Whitworth, UNC and metric threads in all the sizes that you would commonly experience in most things like transmissions and engine rebuilds and stuff like that. And it just makes it so much easier, because you don't have to become a borderline fitter machinist and understand all of that palaver about thread gauges and how to use vernier calipers and things of that nature. You just play the game of go and no go, and when you get to, oh look at that, oh my god, it goes, then you're looking at M12 by 1.75, and I know that even though I can't read this up close. There you go. I think that's what it says, although it might be upside down for you. Who knows? So that's how you tell what size it is. And of course, if you're actually at a physical store with an over-the-counter dude who speaks bolt, you can just take the other fasteners to that dude, and he'll kind of look at it and go, yeah, we've got that, or no, we haven't, or I don't know what that is, kind of thing. So that's how you might be able to hedge against the extortionate price that car manufacturers will undoubtedly want to charge you in the spare parts department. Now, before I let you go, I've just got one other question here, which is relevant to torque to yield bolts, which are those typically head bolts and things of that nature where you tighten them up to a particular torque and then you go another 90 degrees or something and hope you don't hear a cracking sound. So, why for are head bolts torque to yield? Single-use bolts that deform. Is the clamping force not diminished once they're cranked past their deformation point? Great vid, by the way. Thanks for putting so much effort into these. Well, thank you for watching, fake name dude. Here's the thing about fasteners, right? When you do up a fastener with a torque wrench, and we talked about this the other day, this thing here, this is a shoulder screw or a shoulder bolt. It's 12 millimeters, like M12 by 1.75 here, 16 millimeters, pretty precisely ground on the shoulder as well, and it's a grade or class 12.9 socket head. Okay, so this would have a very specific application, and it might be a suspension kind of thing in automotive. They would have a use for something like that in some suspension components, I'm sure. So if you're looking at something like this and you do it up with a torque wrench, there is a lot of latent capacity that is unused in the fastener before you get to the yield point. You stop before the yield point and you don't use that extra stretch capacity, which could be used hypothetically to keep the whole assembly clamped together. So if you're keeping a cylinder head on a block, which is also a fantastic idea if you want the engine to remain serviceable, then you've got a few options. You can have that kind of clamping strategy where you do a particular fastener up to, I don't know, 80 Newton meters, and that gives a particular clamping force, and you've got a lot of latent capacity left in the head bolt, and you just go, yeah, factor of safety. The way they're designing engines, they've got all these conflicting priorities. You need oil and airflow, and you need all kinds of other components, a fuel rail and spark plugs, and you need to fit the manifold in place. And all. There's a whole bunch of things that the design of which all conflict, right? And you've got to come up with a happy medium. So you have to make space for head bolts, yeah? And the space has to include bosses in the blocks and platforms in the heads that are sufficiently robust to house the fasteners. If you can exploit the latent capacity in a fastener and get it to deliver more clamping force, you can make the fastener smaller, and that reduces its requirement for real estate. If you've got a total clamping effort requirement of whatever it is, and you can do that with 10 fasteners instead of 12, then you just saved yourself a shitload of real estate, and you could get better airflow or better oil flow, or use excuse me, less material in the head or the block. And all of these things are like incremental improvements, saving mass, improving efficiency, things of this nature. So you might be able to use 10 M10 bolts that are torque to yield as opposed to a dozen M12 bolts the old-fashioned way. And that leads to a whole bunch of incremental savings. And the only difference is when you service that head, when you pull the head off, if it blows a head gasket, or you just need to rebuild the engine for Christ knows what reason, you want to mod it or do God knows what. But if that head's got to come off, then those fasteners need to be replaced because they've already been cranked to the boundary of the elastic region of that material, and they're frankly not good to go again. So that's a feedback effect, right? Like, it's good to have that efficiency in the design, and you benefit from having that efficiency in the design. The only thing is, it's not all positive. There's always swings and roundabouts, and the roundabout here is got to replace the fasteners, dude. So for components that need to be serviced all the time, such as wheels that need to come off cars fairly frequently to rotate the tyres or to service the brakes, or for any number of other reasons, just to do a roadside repair, torque to yield would be the duddest strategy ever, because you'd have to replace the wheel studs. Whereas with things such as the head on an engine, which hopefully, unless it's a Volkswagen or a Mercedes-Benz or Ford, probably stays there for quite some tens of kilometres, then 1,000 kilometres, then, you know, torque to yield is really not that much of a disadvantage, because replacing the cylinder head is one of those once every couple of 100,000 kilometre events, one would hope.